Send her away. The Duke of Penhall spoke the three words without lifting his eyes from the cold hearth, and every servant in the long gallery of Penhall Court went still as though the ceiling itself had cracked above them. Send her back to whatever parish sold her to me, and tell her steward I will not be trifled with. The girl standing at the far end of the gallery did not move. That more than the letter crushed in his fist was what made Leofric at last turn his head. 7 years he had ruled this house by the mere fact of his silence. Footmen who flinched, a housekeeper who addressed him only in whispers, a whole county that spoke his name the way children speak of the drowned, and in 7 years no one, man or woman, had failed to shrink when he ordered them gone. Yet here stood a slight creature in a travelling cloak 2 seasons out of fashion, her boots muddied to the ankle, a battered trunk at her feet with the rope handle frayed to threads, and she looked at him not with fear, but with a kind of patient, unhurried attention, as one might regard weather that had not yet decided whether to rain. "Your Grace," said Mr. Ostrell, the steward, stepping between them with his hands pressed together as if in prayer, "the arrangement was made by your late father's own hand. The settlement is signed. The banns. My father is 3 years in the ground and cannot be married to her in my stead." Leofric rose. He was a tall man, and grief had pared him down to something hard and unlovely, all shoulder and jaw, and a scar that ran pale from his left temple into his hair. And he had learned long ago the use of his own height as one learns the use of a blade. Servants gave way before him like water. "I did not consent to a bride. I consented to be left alone. Those are not the same, Ostrell, however my father's lawyers may have dressed them. The contract binds the dukedom, sir, not merely the man." The steward's voice had gone thin. "If you repudiate it, the Ledford family may bring suit, and the mortgages upon the West Farms." "Then let them sue." He had crossed half the length of the gallery now, past the shrouded portraits, past the great case clock whose pendulum he had ordered stopped 7 years since so that it might never again mark an hour he did not wish to keep. He stopped an arm's length from the girl and looked down at her, and he pitched his voice low, for cruelty needs no volume when it is certain of itself. "You have come a long way to be refused. I am sorry for your journey. I am not sorry for the refusal. Go home." He had expected tears. Tears he knew the management of, tears he could outlast. What he had not expected was that she would set down the small reticule she carried, draw off one worn glove finger by finger, and offer him her bare hand as calmly as though he had asked her to dance. "Fian Ledford," she said, "since no one has thought to tell you my name, and it seems ill-mannered to be dismissed by a man who does not know it." The hand hung there between them in the cold air. Behind him he heard Mr. Ostrell draw breath and hold it. A housemaid by the door had pressed her apron to her mouth. And Leofric, who had not touched another living soul by choice in 7 years, who wore his gloves to dine and to ride and very nearly to sleep, stood frozen before the outstretched hand of a nobody in muddied boots, and felt, to his own furious astonishment, the smallest disturbance somewhere beneath the ice, as when a stone drops far down a well and the sound comes back long after you have ceased to listen for it. He did not take the hand. He was not so far undone as that. But neither could he quite look away from it, from the plainness of it, the reddened knuckles that spoke of a life with no maid to soften them, the steadiness with which she held it out though a lesser courage would have let it fall. "You will find," he said, "that names are of no use to me. I have forgotten most of the ones worth keeping. Then I shall not burden you with mine longer than the errand requires." She let the hand drop, not snatched back in shame, but lowered, deliberate, the way one closes a door one intends to be able to open again. "I was told you were expecting me. I was told a great deal, on the road, by a great many people who had never met you and were very sure of what you were." A faint line appeared between her brows. "I find they were half right, which is more than I hoped for and less than I feared." Leofric had been reviled to his face, perhaps twice in 7 years, and pitied 1,000 times, and flattered without number by mothers with marriageable daughters who saw past the scar to the acreage. He had no ready answer for a woman who neither reviled nor pitied nor flattered, but only measured him, and found the measurement wanting in some particular she did not trouble to name. "And what?" he heard himself ask, against every intention. "Were you told?" "That you had not spoken above what was necessary since your wife died." that the clocks are stopped and the shutters closed on the east wing, and no fire is laid in the room where the child slept. Her voice did not soften as she said it, which was somehow worse than if it had. She laid the words down plainly, like a servant laying the table, and each one struck him in a place he had thought long since gone numb. That the Duke of Penhall is not cruel precisely, but that he has made a cruelty of his own grief and hung it about the necks of everyone who serves him, and that no one in 3 counties will say so to his face because they are afraid of him. She lifted her chin a very little. I am not, your grace. I have nothing you can take from me. You will observe I have already lost most of it. The gallery was utterly silent. Even the wind at the high windows seemed to have stopped to hear how a duke would answer being spoken to so. Leofric was aware of the servants at the edges of his vision, of Austrel white as paper, of the appalling, the intolerable fact that this girl had said aloud, in the space of a single breath, the thing his entire household had spent 7 years pretending not to know. He should have destroyed her for it. He knew a dozen ways. Cold words were the least of them. He opened his mouth to begin and found, where the venom ought to have been, only a strange and unfamiliar exhaustion, as though her honesty had let some pressure out of him that his anger had been feeding upon. You are impertinent, he said. It came out without heat. It came out, God help him, almost as an observation. I am tired, Fine answered, and cold, and I have not eaten since a coaching inn at Marbury where the landlord charged me for a fire I was too poor to sit near. I do not doubt I am impertinent as well. The two often keep company. The corner of her mouth moved, not a smile. He would not grant it that, but the memory of where a smile might one day sit. You may turn me out into the dark if you wish it. I only ask that you feed me first, so that I may have the strength to be properly indignant about it on the road. And Leofric, Duke of Penhall, who had not laughed since the year his world ended, felt something catch in his chest, not laughter. He would have died before called it that. But a sharp, involuntary contraction, quickly mastered, that left him more shaken than any grief had done in a 12-month. He turned from her so that she should not see it. He looked instead at Austrel, whose expression had passed from terror into a wild, dawning hope, and he despised the man a little for hoping. Mrs. Corley, he said. The housekeeper materialized from the shadow of the stair as though she had never been anywhere else. The small dining parlour. Bread and cold meat and whatever else there is. Miss Ledford has ridden a long way to insult me and should not do it on an empty stomach. Yes, your grace. Mrs. Corley's voice trembled on the ordinary words. It had been a long time, Leofric understood, since he had given an order that was not an order to withdraw. That is not consent, he said sharply to the room at large, to Austrel, to the girl, to himself. It is bread. A man may feed a stranger without wedding her. Do not any of you imagine otherwise. But the ice had shifted, and he knew it, and he hated that he knew it, and he walked from the gallery with his hands clasped hard behind his back, so that no one should see they were not quite steady. He did not go to the parlour. He went, as he went every evening at this hour, and at a dozen others, to the east wing, to the tall white door he had not permitted to be opened save by his own hand, and he stood before it in the dark with the crushed letter still in his fist. Behind that door was a nursery in which everything remained as it had been on a morning 7 years gone, a rocking horse with a real horsehair mane, a shelf of painted soldiers, a little bed no larger than a man's outstretched arm. He did not go in, he never went in. He only stood, as a man stands at a grave, and let the cold come up through the floor into his bones, and told himself, as he told himself nightly, that this was penance and not cowardice, that a man who had failed to save the 2 people God had given him to protect had forfeited the right to warmth. The fever had taken them within a single week. First the boy, Edmund, not yet 4, with his mother's dark eyes and a laugh that had carried the length of these very halls, and then Cora, his wife, worn to nothing, nursing the child she could not save. Leofric had been in London when the express reached him, arguing a point of drainage in the House of Lords, dining at his club, sleeping in a soft bed while the 2 hearts he loved best guttered out 60 miles away. There had been no quarrel between them at his leaving. That was a mercy he had never learned to take comfort in. He had kissed the boy's warm forehead and promised to bring him a wooden ship from the city, and he had gone easy and unhurried, a man who believed he had all the years in the world. He had ridden back through a night and a day, changing horses until they foundered under him, and had come too late by 6 hours to hold either of them living. And in the 7 years since, he had constructed of his own remorse a fortress, and mistaken it for grief, and let the whole world believe he mourned when in truth he punished, himself first, and everyone within reach after, because a man who deserves no comfort cannot bear to see others take it. He knew this. That was the worst of it, and the thing no one guessed. The Duke of Penhall was not a man who had forgotten how to feel. He was a man who had decided, coldly and on purpose, that he had no right to. There was no villain in his story to be conquered, no ogre in the tower. There was only himself, standing at a white door, guarding a nursery against the living as jealously as any dragon its gold. From below, faintly came a sound he did not at first recognize, so long had it been absent from the halls of Penhall Court. A voice. A woman's voice, and then, astonishingly, another answering it, Mrs. Corley's. And could that be laughter? Thin and startled and quickly hushed, the laughter of a servant who has forgotten herself and remembered too late where she is. He found he had moved to the head of the east stair without deciding to. Below, through the half-open parlour door, lamplight fell warm across the flagstones, and within it the girl's voice ran on, low and easy, saying something he could not catch, and Mrs. Corley laughed again. Helplessly this time, the way people laugh who have not done it in years and find the muscle stiff. Leofric stood in the dark at the top of his own stair like a thief in his own house and listened to warmth being made below him out of nothing but bread and a stranger's kindness. And he felt the old fury rise, that she should do in one evening what he had forbidden his household for 7 years, that she should walk into his cold and light a fire in it without so much as asking his leave. He would put a stop to it. He would go down and remind them all whose house this was, whose grief set the temperature of its rooms. He descended 3 steps. He stopped. Through the gap of the door he could see her now, seated at the plain deal table of the servants' parlour rather than any place fit for the bride his father had bought, her cloak still about her shoulders, breaking bread with her reddened hands and talking, not to charm, he saw, for she did not know she was watched, but simply asking Mrs. Corley some question about the house, about the gardens gone to seed, about the orchard beyond the ha-ha, and listening to the answer with her whole grave attention, as though the opinion of a duke's housekeeper were a thing worth the having. And Mrs. Corley, 20 years in his service, whom he could not have described the face of an hour ago, was answering her with colour in her cheeks and her hands moving as she spoke. He should not have been able to see anything remarkable in it. A woman eating, a servant talking. And yet Leofric stood on the stair unable to advance or retreat, and understood, with the particular dread of a man who feels the ground he has trusted begin to move beneath him, that the danger to his fortress had not come armed. It had come cold and hungry and honest, in muddied boots, and it had knocked once and been refused and sat down at the kitchen table anyway to be kind to his people while it waited for him to change his mind. He would not change his mind. He told himself so, standing in the dark, 3 steps down and unable to take a fourth. In the morning he would send for the carriage and set her upon the road with money enough for the journey and a letter absolving her family of any breach. And the house would fold back into its silence like water closing over a stone, and he would stand at the white door as he had always stood, and that would be the end of fine Ledford and her impertinence in a bare offered hand. Below, she looked up. She could not have heard him. He had made no sound, but she turned her head toward the dark of the doorway, as though she had felt his regard the way one feels a draught, and for a long moment she looked directly up the stair to where he stood unseen in the shadow, and though he knew, he was almost certain, that she could make out nothing there but blackness, still it seemed to him that she saw him perfectly, the whole cold length of him, the scar and the clenched hands and the 7 years, and was not troubled by any of it. "Your Grace," she said, quite gently into the dark, not rising, not afraid, "there is bread enough for 2. If you find you have grown tired of standing where you cannot be seen." Leofric did not answer. He could not have said a word to save his soul. He turned and went back up into the black of the east wing and stood again at the white door, with his heart going hard against his ribs like a thing that had been struck after long stillness and did not yet know whether it had been broken or woken. He would send her away in the morning. He was almost certain he would send her away in the morning, And for the first time in 7 years, standing before the nursery he could not enter, the Duke of Penhall was afraid of the coming of the light, not because it would find him grieving, but because some traitor part of him, small and cold and long buried, had begun, against all his stern forbidding, to want the morning to come. The shards of the broken teacup still lay scattered across the parquet when the Duke of Penhall crossed the length of the drawing-room to stand above them, and the whole assembly held its breath, as though a storm had walked in on 2 legs. No one had seen him leave his study before dusk in longer than most of them could recall, yet here he was, tall and unsmiling in his morning black, looking down not at the ruined porcelain but at the young woman kneeling to gather it. She did not scramble. That was the first thing Leofric noticed, and it lodged to him like a splinter he could not work loose. A servant girl would have fled. A guest of consequence would have summoned a footman with a lift of one finger and gone on with her conversation, as if the accident belonged to someone beneath her notice. This one did neither. She knelt in her plain grey stuff gown, gathering the broken pieces into her cupped palm with a care that seemed almost tender, as though the cup had been a living thing that deserved to be handled gently even in its ruin. "You will cut yourself," he said. His own voice startled him. It came out lower and rougher than he intended, unused to the shape of ordinary sentences. "Then I shall have only myself to blame, your grace," she answered, and looked up. He had expected fear. He was accustomed to fear. He had built his solitude out of it, brick by brick, until the whole of Penhall Hall stood as a monument to the simple fact that men and women found it easier to leave him alone than to meet his eye. But there was no fear in the face lifted to his. There was contrition, plain and unpretending, and beneath it something steadier that he could not at once name. Her cheeks had gone pink, not with the practiced blush of the ballroom, but with genuine mortification, and her eyes, ordinary hazel, held his without flinching and without simpering. "You are not one of my guests," he said. "No, your grace. I am Miss Ledford. I have been engaged to mend the lace and the mourning things." She rose as she spoke, the fragments cradled in her hand, and dropped him a curtsy that was correct without being obsequious. "Mrs. Harrod set me to carry the tea through, as 2 of the maids are abed with fever, and I have repaid her kindness by breaking your porcelain in front of your company. I am very sorry for it. I will make good the cost from my wages." Across the room, a silver laugh rose and fell. It belonged to Miss Sybil Ellingham, who had arranged herself upon the settee near the fire like a portrait that had grown weary of its frame, and who now lifted a fan to her lips to smother an amusement she plainly wished everyone to see. "Only fancy," she murmured to the widow beside her, though her voice carried, as such voices are trained to carry, a seamstress pouring tea. "One does what one must, I suppose, in a house so sadly wanting in its arrangements." Leofric did not turn his head toward her. He had spent 7 years learning not to turn his head toward the Sybil Ellinghams of the world, toward the mothers who steered their daughters into his path at every assembly, toward the daughters themselves who painted grief upon their faces the moment they crossed his threshold. Believing that a show of feeling was the surest road to a duchess's coronet, he knew the whole performance to its last gesture. He had watched 100 women look at him and see only the title, the estate, the 10,000 a year, and behind it all the delicious tragedy of a man who had buried his wife and shut his heart, a puzzle they each fancied themselves clever enough to solve. Miss Ledford had looked at him and seen a man who did not wish her to cut her hand. The distinction was so slight and so total that he found he had been standing in silence a beat too long. The room felt it. He was aware, at the edges of his notice, of the way the conversation had thinned to nothing, of a dozen faces angled toward him in careful anticipation of the called word or the curt dismissal that was his custom. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to give it to them. A single sentence and Miss Ledford would be gone below stairs with her broken china, and Penhall would settle back into the frozen quiet it had worn for 7 winters. "Leave it," he said instead. "You will fetch a maid to sweep the rest, and you will not have it taken from your wages." Something moved across her face, surprise, quickly mastered. "Your grace is generous." "I am not generous," he said. "I am accurate. The cup was placed too near the edge of the tray. That is the fault of whoever loaded it, not of the hand that carried it." He heard, distantly, how strange the words sounded in his own mouth, This small labor of fairness performed aloud before witnesses. He had not troubled to be fair to anyone in a very long time. It had seemed somehow beneath the reach of a man who had stopped expecting anything of himself but endurance. "Then I shall thank whoever loaded it for the reprieve," Miss Ledford said, and there unmistakably was the faint curve of something at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile aimed at him, not the arch inviting flicker that Miss Ellingham deployed like a fisherman casting over a still pool, only the honest, involuntary flicker of a person who had, against all sense, been very nearly amused by her own disaster. It undid him more than tears would have. He was proof against tears. He had watched them fall for 7 years and felt nothing but the old wariness. He had no armor at all against a woman who could stand in the wreck of her own embarrassment, before the Duke of Penhall and all his frowning consequence, and find the private courage to be almost glad of a small mercy. "I dare say the girl thinks herself very fine," came a dry murmur from the card table, where an elderly gentleman in an old-fashioned wig had been watching the whole scene with the sour relish of a man who found other people's troubles the best entertainment of the evening. "In my day a servant who broke a duke's china had the grace to weep for it, at the least. Manners are quite gone from the lower sort. They give themselves airs." Leofric waited to see her flinch. It was the natural thing. He had watched better-born women than she crumple under a public unkindness half so pointed. But Miss Ledford only turned to the old gentleman with the same unhurried composure she had shown the broken cup, and said without heat and without insolence, "You are quite right that I ought to be sorry, sir, and I am. But I was taught that weeping over what is already broken mends nothing, and only asks others to spend their pity where it can do no good. I would rather spare his Grace's guests the trouble of me." She inclined her head. "I hope you will forgive the interruption to your game." The old man opened his mouth, found nothing in it, and shut it again. Somewhere near the fire a woman tittered, at him, this not at her. And Leofric, standing apart from all of it, felt the corner of his own mouth threaten to do a thing it had not done in 7 years, a thing he arrested at once with the ruthlessness of long practice. He had seen courtiers and colonels manage a hostel room with less than she had just managed with a handful of broken porcelain in her palm, and not a friend in the whole company. She had not raised her voice. She had not begged. She had simply declined, with perfect civility, to be made small. "Go, then," he said, more quietly. She curtsied again and went, her grey skirts whispering against the polished floor, and he watched her the whole length of the room, though he was perfectly aware, that a dozen pairs of eyes were watching him watch her. At the door she paused to let a footman pass, and did not once glance back to see whether the great Duke's regard still followed her. It did. That was the trouble. It did, and he could not for his life account for why. "How very patient you are, your Grace," with the lower orders. Miss Ellingham had risen and drifted to him under cover of the room's returning murmur, her voice pitched now for his ear alone, warm and confiding, as though the two of them shared some elevated understanding from which the seamstress and the servants, and perhaps the whole of common humanity, were pleasantly excluded. "My mother says a great house is known by the manner of its master toward those who serve it. I do think patience the truest mark of breeding, do you?" he said. "I do." She tilted her head, and the firelight found the diamonds at her throat and made a small constellation of them, though I confess I should not have the forbearance. Were the girl in my service, I fear I should have sent her packing. One cannot have things broken. "No," Leofric said. "One cannot." She took the answer as agreement, as she took most things, and something in the untroubled certainty of it wearied him past bearing. He had known Sybil Ellingham for the better part of a season now. She was the niece of an old friend of his late mother's, and the connection had brought her and her ambitions a standing invitation to Penhall that he had never found the energy to revoke. She was handsome. She was accomplished. She played and sang and rode and said all the correct things in all the correct order, and she had never once, in the whole of their acquaintance, said anything he could remember an hour later. "You are very silent this evening," she ventured, when the silence had stretched. "But then you are always silent. I think it the most romantic thing about you, if you will forgive my saying so. A man who has suffered as you have suffered, one feels one ought not to intrude upon it. One feels one ought only to be near and to wait, and to understand. 7 years ago the words might have found their mark. He had been younger then, and rawer, and there had been a season after Eleanor when a soft voice offering to understand had seemed like the one warm room in a frozen house. He had learned. He had learned that those who offered to understand his grief invariably meant to be seen understanding it, that his sorrow was to them a kind of dowry, a proof of depth they might wear as other women wore lace. He had learned it so thoroughly that he no longer felt the old anger when it was offered him. He felt only a great, level tiredness and a wish to be alone. "You mistake me, Miss Ellingham," he said. "There is nothing romantic in it. There is only a man who prefers his own company. You would do better to bestow your patience where it might be repaid." He inclined his head, the smallest courtesy and unmistakably a dismissal, and left her standing by the fire with her fan and her diamonds and the practiced sympathy dying on her lips. He heard the little intake of her breath behind him, the quick recovery, the bright remark tossed to the widow to cover the sting. He did not care. He had long since stopped being able to care what such women thought of him, and the freedom of it was the nearest thing to peace he possessed. But the peace would not settle tonight. He climbed to his study by the back stair, the one the family had used in the days when there had been a family, and shut the door on the murmur of the drawing-room, and stood a while at the tall window with his hands clasped behind him, looking out at nothing. The park lay under a thin blue dusk. Somewhere below a dog barked twice and fell silent, and into the accustomed emptiness of his own mind, unbidden and unwelcome, came the picture of a grey gown and a pair of steady hazel eyes and a voice that had said, "I shall have only myself to blame," without a trace of the fear that everyone else brought into this house like a chill upon their coats. He turned from the window, irritated with it himself, and took up the letter he had been answering before the sound of breaking china had drawn him downstairs against every habit of 7 years. He read 3 lines of it and found he had understood none of them. He set it down again. It was absurd. She was a mender of lace. She would be gone from Penhall within the fortnight, her work done, her wages paid, back to whatever narrow lodging and whatever narrower prospects had sent her out to earn her bread with a needle. He would not think of her again. There was no reason on earth he should. And yet, when Mrs. Harrod tapped at the door an hour later to ask whether his Grace would take his supper in the study as usual, he heard himself say, before he had at all decided, to the seamstress, "Miss Ledford, is she housed comfortably?" The housekeeper, who had served him through all the frozen years and had learned to school her face against every surprise, could not quite school it against this one. "Yes, Your Grace. In the green room off the east passage. She asked for nothing but a good lamp to work by." "See, she has one," he said. "A better one, if there is a better one." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Harrod hesitated in the doorway, the candle throwing its light up into the worn kindness of her face. She had known him since he was a boy. She had wept at Eleanor's funeral and had never once presumed upon her long service to speak of it, and he was grateful to her for that silence as he was grateful to almost no one for almost anything. "It was good of you, sir," she said now, carefully, not to let the girl be blamed. "She has had few enough kindnesses, I think. She does not say so. But one can tell." "How can one tell?" he asked, and was surprised by the question even as he made it. "By how little she expects, Your Grace." Mrs. Harrod dipped her head and drew the door softly to, and left him with that. By how little she expects. The phrase turned over in him like a coin held to the light, showing a different face at every angle. He had passed his whole life among people who expected a great deal, deference advantage, the reflected warmth of his consequence, and had learned to price each of them by the size of their wanting. He had no method at all for a person who wanted nothing from him, for the scale by which he measured the world simply did not descend so far. It was, he thought, a poor sort of nobleman who had grown so accustomed to being courted that plain honesty struck him as a novelty. Yet strike him it had. By how little she expects. He sat with it long after the candle at his elbow had burned down and the house had gone quiet around him. All the guests abed, all the fires banked, the great silent rooms of Penhall keeping their long vigil over a grief that had never once, in 7 years, consented to grow lighter. He thought of the tea splashed across the tray, and the young woman kneeling to gather her own ruin without a whimper. He thought of Sybil Ellingham calling his silence the most romantic thing about him. He thought, and this was the thought he could not put down, the one that kept him from his bed long past his usual hour, of how it had felt, for one strange unguarded moment in the drawing-room, to say a fair and ordinary thing to a person who neither feared him nor wanted anything from him, and to be answered as though he were merely a man. He had not felt it in so long that he had forgotten it had a name. He was not sure, even now, that he could bear to give it one. The lamp, he thought. See, she has a better lamp. It was nothing. It was a trifle, a courtesy such as any master owed the least of those beneath his roof. He told himself so twice, and did not believe it either time, and rose at last and went to his cold bed knowing, with the helpless clarity of a man who has felt the first crack run through a frozen thing, that he would find some reason tomorrow to be where Miss Ledford was. He did not know what he would say. He knew only that he would go, and that the knowing sat in his chest not as peace and not as pain, but as something he had buried 7 years deep and had never expected to feel stir again. The candles had been lit throughout the long gallery of Penhall for the first time in 7 years, and Leofric hated the sight of them. 200 wax tapers ranked in their silver sconces, throwing a warmth across the old panelling that the house had no right to wear. It had been his aunt's doing. The Dowager Marchioness of Vane had descended upon him 3 weeks prior with the settled conviction that a man could not mourn forever, and that the surest cure for grief was a room full of other people's daughters. He had refused her twice. She had prevailed on the third asking, not by argument, but by the simple, immovable fact of having already sent the invitations. So he stood now at the head of his own gallery, in a coat he had not worn since another life, and endured. The assembly moved before him like a tide he was obliged to let break against his boots. Mothers steered their girls into his eye line with the patience of gun dogs. Young men laughed too loudly at their own wit. The musicians his aunt had hired soared gamely at a country air, and the whole bright, chattering machine of it turned upon the axis of him. The mourning Duke, unsmiling, come down at last from his tower, and pretended it did not. He suffered the introductions because refusing them would have cost more effort than bearing them. Miss this of somewhere, the Honourable Miss that, whose mother recited her accomplishments, as though reading a bill of lading. Each of them curtsied, and glanced up at the scar that ran pale from his temple into his hair, and looked hurriedly away as if they had been caught at a keyhole. He had grown used to that. It was, he had come to think, the truest thing anyone did in his presence, that small flinch, that quick averting of the eyes. It told him what all the compliments concealed, and then, across the width of the gallery, he saw the one face that had not flinched. She stood near the cold hearth at the room's far end, where the candlelight thinned and the good families did not trouble to go. He knew her at once, though he had told himself in the days since he would not think of her and had thought of nothing else. Fian Ledford, the companion. She had come in the train of the Ellinghams, carrying Mrs. Ellingham's shawl and Mrs. Ellingham's smelling salts, and Mrs. Ellingham's endless small commands, and she had been set at the edge of the evening the way a footstool is set at the edge of a room, useful, unremarked. Meant not to be seen unless wanted. She was being punished for something. He could read it in the stiff carriage of Sybil Ellingham's shoulders. Miss Ellingham stood at the heart of the light in a gown the colour of champagne, and she was beautiful in the practised way that beauty is when it has been told of itself since the cradle, and she was saying something to her mother behind the ivory sticks of her fan, and both of them were looking at Fian as they said it. Then Sybil laughed, a bright, carrying laugh, pitched to be overheard, and the small knot of young people around her laughed with her, and Fian, at the cold end of the room, went on holding the shawl and looked at no one and let it pass over her like weather. Leofric found that his jaw had tightened. He did not go to her. He was not a man who went to people. People came to him, or they did not, and he had long ceased to mind which. But he watched, and watching, he saw the whole cruelty of it unfold in miniature, as such cruelties always did, too small for anyone to be blamed for, too practised for anyone to have invented on the spot. Began when the dancing formed. Couples took their places down the length of the gallery, and Sybil Ellingham, having secured herself a partner of good family, discovered all at once that she required her handkerchief, which she had left. How vexing, in the anteroom at the very other end of the house. She turned to Fian. Leofric could not hear the words, but he did not need to. He saw the girl set down the shawl. He saw her go, unhurried, through the press of dancers and out at the far door, sent on an errand contrived for no purpose but to display before witnesses how entirely she might be sent. She was gone some minutes. When she returned, handkerchief in hand, the set had already begun, and to reach her mistress she was obliged to go the long way round, close along the wall, past the row of dowagers and past the table where the ratafia and the lemon water stood. And there a young buck of the Ellingham party, flushed with wine and eager to earn Sybil's next laugh, put out his boot. Leofric saw it coming an instant before it happened, and could do nothing across such a distance but watch. Fionn's slipper caught. She pitched forward. Her hand shot out and struck the edge of the little table, and a glass of ratafia went over with a sound that cut clean through the music, the shatter, the gasp, the ugly little silence after. For a moment she knelt among the fragments, the spreading stain darkening the hem of a gown that he could see, even from here, had been turned and mended more than once. The young buck laughed. Sybil's fan came up, and the whole bright room turned to look at the companion on her knees on the floor, and waited, with a kind of appetite, to see her weep or flush or flee. She did none of it. She gathered the broken glass into her palm, the pieces first, carefully, so that no servant should cut a hand on them later, and she rose, and she looked about her not in shame but in a calm, clear apology, and she said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "I am sorry for the noise. I am afraid I am clumsier than I am useful," and she smiled, actually smiled, a small rueful thing at her own expense, so that there was suddenly nothing for the room to laugh at, because she had said it first and said it kindly, and the appetite in the air had nothing to feed upon and died. Leofric had not moved from the head of the gallery, but something in his chest had. He had watched for 7 years the whole of society perform its griefs and its triumphs for an audience, and he had come to believe that everyone, always, was playing to the room. He had believed it of the women who admired his scar, and the men who envied his acres, and the aunt who lit his candles. And here was a girl on her knees in spilled cordial, overlooked, ill-used, with every reason in the world to play the injured party, and she had reached instead for the broken glass so that a housemaid would not bleed. She had not played to the room at all. She had simply been, in the middle of it, entirely herself. He crossed the gallery. He was not aware of deciding to. He was aware only that the distance was closing, that the crowd was parting before him the way it always did, with that ripple of hush and turned heads, and that Sybil Ellingham's face had gone from malice to radiance in the space of a breath as she perceived, wrongly, that the Duke of Penhall was at last coming to her. He passed her without a glance. He stopped before the companion. Fionn straightened, the shards cupped in her hand, and looked up at him. And there it was again, the thing that had undone his guard the first time he had seen it. She did not flinch. Her eyes went to the scar at his temple, as everyone's did once, and then they came back to his eyes and stayed there in steady grey, unafraid, as though the mark were a fact about him no more shaming than the colour of his coat. "Your Grace," she said, and dipped, awkward with her hands full. "You will cut yourself," he said. It was not what he had meant to say. He had not meant to say anything. "Then I shall have earned it," she answered, "for I have quite ruined your floor. The floor has survived worse." He heard how stiff it sounded, how long unused his own courtesy had grown. He put out his hand. "Give them to me." She hesitated. It was not the hesitation of the drawing-room, the little pantomime of reluctance meant to be overcome. It was real, a genuine weighing of whether a duke ought to be handed a fistful of another woman's broken glass. Then she tipped the fragments carefully into his open palm, and her bare fingers brushed the flat of his hand as she did it, a touch of no account, a half-second's warmth, and Leofric felt it travel the length of his arm like the strike of a bell. He turned and set the shards upon the table without haste, and in doing so gave the room his back, and gave her a moment to be unlooked at, and gave himself a moment to master a face he had not had to master in years. "You made them a present of your dignity just now," he said quietly, when he had turned again. "I have watched better people keep less over smaller things." Colour came into her cheek then, not the blush of flattery received, but something graver. "It was not dignity, your Grace. It was only that weeping would have obliged everyone to be kind to me, and they should have hated me for it by morning." A flicker of dry humour crossed her mouth. A companion learns the arithmetic of it. One is permitted to be invisible or to be grateful. Anything else is dear. He looked at her. No one had spoken so plainly to him in longer than he could easily count. They flattered him, or they feared him, or his aunt, they managed him. But no one simply told him the truth of a thing and let it stand. And which you being now? He asked. Invisible or grateful? Neither, I think. She met his eye. You asked me a question as though you wished to know the answer. That is a third thing, and I had not looked for it tonight. You had not looked to be tripped upon my floor either, he said, and yet here we are. No, she agreed, and there was that dry flicker again at the corner of her mouth, though the one, I confess, surprised me less than the other. I have been coming to houses like this since I was 17, Your Grace, and I have learned what a room says that expects of a girl in a gown such as mine. It is not conversation. She looked down at the stain darkening at her hem, and then, unhurried, back up at him. You will forgive me if I am slow to trust it. A companion who mistakes notice for kindness does not remain a companion long. She becomes a caution told to other girls. The plainness of it struck him, not bitter, not pleading, only the flat report of a thing survived. He had spoken to 100 women who wished him to believe they had suffered, and not one of them had said so as she said it, as though it were merely the weather she walked in and no fault of his to be soothed. Then I shall not ask you to trust it, he said. I will only tell you that I have watched this room and every room like it for a long time, and I know the difference between a person who is being clever and a person who is being kind. You were being kind. It cost you, and you did it anyway, and you let them think it was clumsiness so the cost should not show. I do not mistake that, Miss Ledford. Whatever else I am not so far gone as that. Across the room he could feel the pressure of 100 glances, the dowager's avid, the mother's calculating. Sybil Ellingham's turned suddenly to flint. He was aware that he had done an extraordinary thing, that the Duke, who had not been seen to address a woman with warmth in 7 years, was standing at the cold end of his own gallery in earnest conversation with a paid companion in a stained gown, and that the story of it would be in every morning room in 3 counties by Thursday. He found, with a faint astonishment, that he did not care. You are not clumsy, he said, her brows lifted. You said to the room that you were clumsier than you were useful. It was well done, it disarmed them. But it was not true. A boot was put out to trip you. I saw it done. He let that land. You took the blame for a cruelty so that the cruelty would have no sport. That is not clumsiness, Miss Ledford. That is a kind of courage I had thought gone out of the world. For the first time she looked away from him, not in flinching, but as one looks away from a light held too near. You saw that, she said low. I see a great deal from up there, he said, at the head of the room, where no one troubles to look back. It is the one mercy of being feared. One is left alone to watch. He had not intended to say so much. The words had come up out of some long-shut place, and he heard in his own voice the loneliness he never named, laid bare before a stranger by the light of 200 candles he had not wanted lit. She heard it too. He saw her hear it. Her face changed, not to pity, which he could not have borne and would have turned from at once, but to a grave, quiet understanding, as though she had been handed something and knew its weight. That is a very high place to stand, Your Grace, she said gently, and a cold one, I should think, for all the candles. The music had ended. The set was breaking up. Couples turned and bowed. Somewhere his aunt's voice rose, marshalling the evening onward. And Sybil Ellingham was crossing the floor toward them now with her mother in her wake, and her smile fixed like a thing pinned to a board, come to reclaim her companion and to insert herself, by whatever means, between the Duke and the impertinence of a servant, who had caught his eye. Leofric felt the old iron come down over him, the reserve that had kept him whole, or something like whole, since the world had last broken him. He straightened, his face closed. And Fionn, quick as she was, saw the shutter fall and understood it, and stepped back into her proper smallness before Sybil could reach them, taking up Mrs. Ellingham's shawl again as though she had never set it down. Your Grace is very good, she said, the flat, formal words of a servant dismissed. But under them, meant for him alone, her eyes said something else entirely, something that was almost a question and almost a thanks, and she dropped her curtsy and was gone into the crowd before Sybil Ellingham could arrange her own face to advantage. Your Grace, Sybil began, breathless, arriving, I do. Ledford has not wearied you. She is a good, dull creature, but she has no notion of when to keep from underfoot. She has, I find, a better notion of it than most, Leofric said and bowed, exactly as courtesy required and not 1 degree beyond it, and turned and left her standing. He did not stay for the supper. He gave his aunt some word about the hour and the road and let her make of it what she would, and he went up alone through the dark upper reaches of the house, away from the candles, to the cold silent gallery of his own rooms where no taper had been lit and no music reached. He had wanted, all evening, precisely this, the dark, the quiet, the familiar walls of his solitude closing round him like a coat he had worn so long he no longer felt its weight. But the quiet tonight would not hold him. He stood at the tall window with the great house murmuring faintly below and the July dark pressing at the glass, and he found that he could not summon the emptiness he had come up here to inhabit. Into it, unbidden, came a fistful of broken glass gathered so that a housemaid should not bleed. A grey, steady gaze that had not once flinched from the mark on his face. A voice low and plain telling him his high place was a cold one and being, God help him, right. You asked me a question as though you wished to know the answer. He pressed his fingertips to the cold pane and shut his eyes, and behind them the room he had spent 7 years emptying was suddenly, dangerously full. He told himself she was a companion in a mended gown, sent for handkerchiefs, beneath his notice and beneath the notice of everyone in that bright and stupid room. He told himself he had spoken to her out of nothing but distaste for a cruelty, and would think of no more. He told himself the door was shut, as it had been shut for 7 years, and that he wished it so. He stood a long time at the window in the dark, telling himself these things. He did not believe a word of them. 3 days he kept to the east wing, and 3 days her voice followed him through it. Leofric told himself the work of the estate required his attention, that the accounts had gone too long unread and the tenants' letters wanted answers, and he sat at the great desk with the ledgers open and understood not a figure upon the page. He heard instead the way Fian Ledford had said his name at the foot of the stair, plain and unafraid, as though the title that made grown men lower their eyes were only a word like any other. He had turned from her that night. He had climbed to his rooms and shut the door and stood a long while in the dark with his hand still upon the wood, and he had not slept. On the 4th day he could bear the walls no longer. He ordered his horse saddled before the house was fully waking, thinking to ride the far boundary where no one went, where the beechwood swallowed the paths and a man might be alone with his own silence. That was the thing he had learned to want above all others in 7 years, to be let alone. It had become a kind of shelter, and he had furnished it as other men furnished houses, and he had believed himself content within it. He was no longer certain that he was. The mist lay low over the park when he came down, and the gravel was wet, and there, near the yew walk that led toward the old kitchen garden, he saw her. Fian had a basket upon her arm and her sleeves turned back to the elbow, and she was cutting something from the beds along the wall with a pair of shears too large for the task. She did not see him at first. He might have gone on. The stable lay to his left, and the whole grey morning stood open before him, and every habit of 7 years bid him mount and be gone. Instead he stood where he was and watched her work, and something in his chest, long stiff, gave a small and painful turn. "You rise early, Miss Ledford," he said. She startled, and the shears slipped, and a stem she had meant to keep fell severed to the path. She looked at it, and then at him, and to his surprise she laughed, low and rueful, at herself. "I do most things badly before breakfast, your grace, and cutting is chief among them. Mrs. Trewin sent me for rosemary, and I have murdered a good deal of it that gave no offence. The garden has not been tended in some years," he said. "You will find it much overgrown." "I find it beautiful," she answered simply, and bent to gather the fallen stem. "Things left to themselves grow strange, but they do not grow ugly. That one has thrown itself clear over the wall to reach the light. I could not bring myself to cut it back." He came nearer without deciding to. The mist beaded on the shoulders of his coat and on her uncovered hair, and he saw that her hands were reddened with the cold, and that she had not thought to bring gloves, and he felt an absurd and unfamiliar wish to say something of it, and did not. "You need not do the work of the kitchen," he said instead. "You are a guest under this roof." Fian straightened and met his eyes, and there was no reproach in her, only a candour that undid him a little more each time she turned it upon him. I am a guest who has no coin to be otherwise, your grace. My aunt's charity brought me here, and my aunt's charity may send me off again when it pleases her, and in between I would rather be of some use than sit in a fine room being reminded that I am a burden. Mrs. Trewin does not mind me. The rosemary minds me a great deal, but Mrs. Trewin does not. She said it lightly, without the smallest bid for his pity, and it was the lightness, that struck him harder than any grief could have done. Your aunt, he said. Lady Ellingham. A small pause, courteous, that told him everything the words did not. My mother's elder sister. When my father's living was lost and my mother followed him within the year, there was no one else. I do not complain of it. There are girls with no aunt at all, and I have seen where they end, but I will not pretend to be what I am not, and I am not a lady of leisure. I am a poor relation who is handy with a needle and useless with a pair of shears. Again that low laugh, turned wholly against herself, so that he could not laugh with her and could not bear that she laughed alone. Sybil Ellingham is your cousin, then, he said. He thought of the drawing-room 3 nights past, of the girl in the primrose silk who had spoken over Fionn as though she were a chair, of the aunt's cool voice steering the conversation ever away from the plain niece in the made-over gown. He had watched Fionn Barrett that evening with a straight back and a quiet mouth, and he had understood, watching, exactly the shape of the household she came from, and he had been ashamed that he had not spoken. She is, said Fionn, and she is to be much admired, and she knows it, which spares the rest of us the labour. It was so nearly wicked, and so gently said, that the corner of his mouth moved before he could prevent it. She saw. He watched her see it, watched the small astonished gladness cross her face, and he turned his head away as a man turns from a fire grown too bright. Walk with me, he heard himself say. The rosemary will keep. They went along the wall together, past the espaliered piers gone wild and the beds where lavender had seeded itself in careless drifts, and the mist began to lift as they walked, thinning to silver, letting through a low and watery sun. He did not offer his arm. He was too aware of her nearness for that, of the small distance between his sleeve and hers that seemed to hum like a struck glass. She spoke of the garden, of what might be saved and what wanted only patience, and he found that he was listening not for the sense of it, but for the sound, for the warmth that ran under her plain words like a current under still water. You know these beds, he said. My father kept a garden, she said, a small one. He was a clergyman with more love of growing things than of sermons, though he preached those well enough. He taught me the names of everything, the proper Latin and the common both, and he said a man who knows the name of a thing has already half befriended it. She touched a leaf as she passed, lightly, the way one might touch a sleeping child. I have forgotten a great deal since. But not the names. Those stay. And you have carried them here, to a garden no one troubles to name. She looked at him then, and the look held longer than either of them meant it to. Perhaps that is why I like it, your grace. It has been let alone so long that everyone has stopped expecting anything of it. And still it grows, every spring, whether anyone comes to see or not. She said it of the garden. He knew, and he thought she knew, that she did not say it only of the garden, and the knowing passed between them in the silver light, and neither of them named it, and the current beneath her words ran suddenly very deep. They had come to the old stone bench at the garden's end, green with moss, and here she set down her basket, and here, because the sun had found a gap in the wall and warmed the stone, they sat a careful arm's length apart. Below them the park fell away toward the lake, and the great house stood grey and shuttered against the brightening sky, and Leofric looked at it as a stranger might, as she must see it, a beautiful house with all its windows closed. They say things of you, Fionn said quietly. In the drawing-rooms. My aunt says them louder than most. I am aware of what they say. His voice came out harder than he intended, the old iron rising of its own accord. That the Duke of Penhall has not smiled in 7 years. That he keeps his dead in the west rooms and will let no one open the shutters. That he is savage or mad or merely cruel, and that a wise woman keeps her distance. He had never said any of it aloud. It astonished him to hear it in his own mouth, laid flat before her like cards upon a table. You need not pretend you have not heard it. You would be the only soul in 3 counties who had not. I have heard it, she said. I did not believe the half. And now that I have sat with you in a wet garden while you tell a poor relation the names of nothing at all, I believe still less." She turned upon the bench to face him, and her grey eyes were steady, and there was in them no fear of him, none of the wariness he had grown so used to that he had ceased to feel it as a wound. "I think, your grace, that you are not savage. I think you are grieving, and have been so long that the whole world has agreed to call it something else, because grief is frightening to look at, and it is easier to name a man a monster than to sit with him in his sorrow." He could not answer her. The words had gone from him entirely. 7 years he had built the silence stone by stone, and she had set her hand against it, and it had shifted, and he sat with his heart pounding like a boy's and could not for his life have named the emotion that filled him, save that it was not the numbness he had worn so long, and that it hurt, and that he did not want it to stop. "You presume a great deal," he managed. "I do," she agreed, unashamed. "I have nothing else to presume with. When a woman has no fortune and no rank and no beauty, to speak of honesty is the whole of her estate, and I have grown rich in it for want of anything else to spend." Her mouth curved, but her eyes did not leave his. "I will not flatter you. There are a dozen women in my aunt's acquaintance who would do it far better, and you would be right to trust none of them. But I will tell you the truth, and the truth is that I have not once, in 3 days under this roof, thought of you as anyone but a man. It is you who insist upon the rest." The sun broke fully then over the wall and fell across the space between them, and he saw the fine chapped skin of her cold hands where they lay in her lap, and without thought, without permission, he reached and covered the nearer one with his own. She went very still. Her hand was cold beneath his and small, and it did not pull away. He felt the quick startled beat of the pulse at her wrist against his fingers, and he felt his own answer it, and for the length of a held breath the whole grey morning narrowed to the warmth of that single point of contact, to the terrible, longed-for, ordinary weight of one human hand within another. He had not touched anyone in kindness in 7 years. He had forgotten that it could be borne. He had forgotten that it could be wanted this much. "Miss Ledford," he said, and his voice was not steady, and he did not care. "Fian," she said softly. "If we are to be honest, your grace, you may as well use my name, Fian." It came from somewhere beneath the iron low and rough, and he saw her breath catch to hear it. Her fingers turned the smallest fraction, so that they lay not beneath his hand, but within it, palm to palm, and he closed his own around them and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them moved to close the last small distance, and neither of them let go. The wanting of it stood plain in the air between them, unspoken and undeniable, and he understood in that moment with a clarity that frightened him that he was no longer the man he had been 3 days before, that the shelter he had built was breached past mending, and that he would sooner tear it down with his own hands than go back inside it alone. It was the bell that broke them, the far thin sound of the breakfast bell carrying across the wet park, and she drew her hand from his gently, not in retreat but in regret, and he let it go because he must. She rose and gathered her murdered rosemary, and stood a moment looking down at him where he sat with the sun on his face and his heart laid open like the shuttered house behind them. "They will be looking for me," she said. "My aunt does not like me to be absent from the table. She fears I will be thought to have ideas above my station." A wry gleam. "She is not wrong. I have had a great many this morning." "Fian," he stood. He was near enough to see the flecks of green in her grey eyes, near enough that a step would have closed it all. "Your aunt came to Penhall for a reason. She did not accept my mother's old invitation out of any love for the dead. She came because there is a duke here, and an unmarried one, and a daughter she means to see a duchess." He had known it since the carriage first came up the drive. He had meant to endure the visit as he endured all such visits, with cold courtesy and closed doors, and to be rid of them when the fortnight ended. He had not counted on the plain niece with the shears. "You should know what house you stand in. When she learns that I have walked in a garden with you and not with Cybele, she will not thank you for it." Something crossed Fian's face then, quick and quickly mastered, and it was not surprise, and that told him she had known it all along and had said nothing, and had asked nothing of him in the garden but the truth. "No," she said, "she will not." She lifted her chin. "But I have never been of much use to my aunt's ambitions, your grace, and I find this morning that I mind it less than ever. Whatever comes of it, I would not unwalk this walk. I hope you will believe that, whatever she says of me at your table. I will believe you, he said, above every voice in that room. She smiled at him, and it was not the wry smile she wore against the world, but something quieter and more grave, a thing given rather than defended with. And she turned and went up the yew walk toward the house with her basket on her arm and her murdered rosemary, and did not look back. And he stood in the ruined garden and watched her go until the mist took her. For a long time he did not move. The sun climbed, and the moss dried on the old bench, and the great grey house waited with all its shutters closed, and Leofric, Duke of Penhall, stood among the overgrown beds and felt the ground he had held for 7 years shift beneath him past all recovering. He knew what waited within those walls. He knew Lady Ellingham's cool eyes and her careful designs, and he knew that a woman like that, thwarted, did not forgive, that she would find the girl's tenderest place and press upon it, that the poorest and most defenseless soul in that house would be made to pay for a duke's stolen hour in a garden. He should never have touched her hand. He should never have said her name in that low, broken voice that had frightened them both. To love was to give another the whole of yourself to lose, and he had lost once already, so completely that 7 years had not healed it. And here he stood offering the wound again to a girl with reddened hands who had nothing in the world but her honesty and no shield at all against what he might bring down upon her. And still standing there, he could not wish it undone. That was the worst of it, and the truest. He turned at last toward the house, toward the closed door and the cold table and the aunt who was even now, he did not doubt, taking careful note of an empty chair, and he walked back through the wet grass with his hand still warm where hers had lain, knowing that he carried something now that could be broken, and that he had, for the first time in 7 years, something left to lose. He did not sleep that night, and he had not expected to. The memory of her hand hovering a breath from his own, there in the blue dusk of the walled garden, followed him up the great stair and into the cold vault of his chamber, where the fire had burned to embers and no one had thought to rebuild it. He stood a long while at the window with the casement open to the damp, and told himself the thing that had passed between them was nothing, a trick of failing light, a kindness misread. He was a practiced liar in his own cause. He had told himself a great many comforting untruths across 7 years, and had believed almost none of them, and this one crumbled fastest of all, for he had wanted in that garden to close the distance. He had wanted it with a violence that frightened him more than any grief. That was the danger of Fionn Ledford. She asked nothing of him, and so he found himself wishing to give her everything, and a man with nothing left to give is never so ruined as when he begins to hope. By morning he had resolved to be colder. It was the only defence he had ever known, and it had served him faithfully. The whole county called him the Mourning Duke and crossed to the far side of the lane when his carriage passed, and he had let them, for a man feared is a man left alone, and a man left alone cannot be asked to feel. He would be feared again. He would put the great cold weight of Penhall back between them, and she would learn, as all the others had learned, that there was nothing behind his silence but ash. The resolution lasted until the middle of the forenoon, when he came upon her in the long gallery. She had not heard him. She stood before the portraits, the neglected ones nearest the north end where the light was poor and the frames had gone dull with smoke, and she was looking up at a painting he had not permitted himself to look at in 7 years. He knew it without seeing it. He could have told her, with his eyes shut, the exact fall of the painted hair, the particular tilt of the painted chin, the pale hand resting on the head of a spaniel long since dead. She was beautiful, Fionn said, when she heard his step. She did not startle, and she did not pretend she had been looking elsewhere. That was her way. She met a thing squarely, and let him decide what to do with the truth of it. Forgive me. I lost myself. No one told me not to come to this end of the gallery, and I see now that someone ought to have. No one comes to this end of the gallery, he said. His voice had gone to the flat, distant register he used for stewards and strangers. The servants have standing orders. Then I have trespassed twice over. She stepped back from the portrait, but she did not lower her eyes from it. She has your daughter's look about the brow, or your daughter had hers. I ask your pardon. I do not know how one is meant to speak of it. The floor of the gallery seemed to tilt beneath him. He had schooled the whole household to a careful, terrified silence on the subject. The word daughter had not been spoken aloud in his hearing since the year of the burying. To have it said plainly and gently and without the sickly pity that made him wish to break things, it undid him faster than cruelty ever could. "Who told you," he said very low, "that I had a daughter?" "No one told me." She turned to him then, and there was no fear in her face, only a grave and steady sorrow that was somehow worse. "There is a child's chair in the small parlor that no one sits in, and a nursery at the top of the house that is kept swept and never opened. And you look at the children in the village the way a man looks at a fire in winter, from across the room and never too long." She paused. "I have been overlooked my whole life, Your Grace. It teaches one to watch. I see a great many things I am not meant to see." He should have dismissed her. He had dismissed men from his service for far less, for a glance held too long at the scar on his right hand, for a whispered word in the servants' hall. He opened his mouth to do it, to summon the cold, to name her impertinent, to send her from the room and from the house and be rid of the unbearable relief of being seen. And what came out instead, torn from some place he had walled off and mortared shut, was the truth. Her name was Eleanor, he said. She lived 11 days. Fine did not move toward him. She had the wisdom not to. A touch just then would have shattered him, and she seemed to know it. She only stood and listened, and let the silence be a thing he could fill or not, as he chose. "My wife was Cordelia," he went on, and the name came strangely to his tongue, rusted from disuse. "We had been wed 3 years and grieved for a child the whole of them, and when at last the child came, I did the unpardonable thing. I left them. There was business in town, a matter of drainage and rents that any steward alive could have managed, and I told myself a duke must attend to his own affairs, and I told myself the babe was small but sound, and I told myself I should be gone a fortnight and no more." His mouth twisted. "I was gone 9 days when the fire took the east wing. They think a lamp in the nursery past midnight. Cordelia would not leave the child. By the time they reached her, the floor had given. They brought neither of them out." He stopped, and the stopping cost him. He had never before let himself go so far along that road, and the ground at the end of it was worse than he remembered, for the words made it real again, made it present. Put him once more on the London road in the grey of a wet dawn, with a rider coming hard toward him and the wrong look on the rider's face. He had known before the man spoke. He had known from a mile off, the way one knows a thing the body has understood before the mind will bear it. "I did not weep," he said, almost to himself. "That is the part they cannot forgive me either. I stood in my own courtyard among the ruins, and I did not weep, and the whole county marked it and set it down against me. They did not understand that a man cannot weep for what he cannot yet believe. I have made up the arrears since. I have wept 7 years. I have simply had the decency to do it where no one might see." He heard the words fall into the cold air of the gallery and could scarcely believe he had said them. In 7 years he had never once said them aloud, not to the physician, not to his mother before she died, not to God, whom he had ceased on that night to trouble with any petition whatsoever. "So you see," he said, and now the cold came back into his voice, welcome as an old coat. "The county has the right of it. They call me the Mourning Duke and think me savage, and they are kind, for savage is the gentler word. A savage kills for hunger or for fear. I killed for rents. I was not here, Miss Ledford. I was 3 counties distant, arguing over a mill stream, while everything I was answerable for burned. That is the man before you. Look your fill." He held up his right hand, the one he kept always gloved, the one he had ungloved for no living soul. The burn had healed badly across the back of it and up the wrist, the skin drawn and silvered and wrong. "I came home to the ruin 2 days after," he said. "I would not be kept from it. I dug in it with my own hands until they pulled me out. There was nothing to find. This is all I brought away." He waited for her to flinch. He had planned it, in the buried and calculating part of him, to make himself hideous, to say the worst of it in the ugliest words, so that she might look on him with the horror that was his due and go, and be safe and be spared him. He had driven her, in the space of 5 minutes, to the very edge of a cliff, and he stood ready to watch her fall away from him and call it mercy. Fionn looked at the scarred hand, and then, without haste, without the smallest tremor, she reached out and took it in both of hers. "You did not kill them," she said. He tried to draw the hand back. She held it. He was a strong man and she was not, and yet he could not have freed himself without doing her a violence, and so he stood, trembling, his ruined hand cradled between her two warm ones as though it were something that might be mended. "A lamp killed them," she said, "and an old floor, and a house too great to wake in time. You were a husband who went to see to his lands, as 10,000 husbands did that same week and came home to no sorrow at all. You have taken a chance of the world and made it your crime, and you have served yourself 7 years' sentence for it, and I think, forgive me, I think you would sooner be guilty than grieved. Guilt a man may punish, grief only endures." "You know nothing of it," he said, "but there was no force in it. I know that Eleanor lived 11 days and had someone in the world who named her, and remembers and cannot say her name without bleeding," Fian said. "I know that is not the account of a savage." "I have kept house for a savage, your grace. I have wiped his table and turned my face to the wall. You are not he." For one moment, one traitorous, radiant moment, he let himself feel the warmth of her hands and believe her. He felt the whole frozen weight of 7 years shift upon its foundation, as ice shifts on a river in the first false warmth of a thaw, groaning, cracking, threatening to break and carry everything downstream. And it was precisely that, the sheer giddy, unbearable relief of it, that terrified him back into the cold, because he had felt this once before. He had stood in the warmth of a woman's certainty and believed himself safe, believed the world would be gentle with what he loved, and the world had answered him with fire. He would not be taught that lesson twice. He would not stand again at a window waiting for a house to be whole, and come home to ash. And here was the cruelest arithmetic of all, that the more he wanted Fian Ledford, the more he had to lose, and the more he had to lose, the surer the world was to take it, for that was the only lesson it had ever troubled to teach him. He took his hand from hers. This time she let it go, and the letting go was worse than any struggle. "You will not come to this end of the gallery again," he said, "nor to the nursery, nor the small parlour. You forget yourself, Miss Ledford. You are here upon my sister's charity to companion her guests, and you have made yourself free of my grief as though it were a common room. It is not. It is the only thing I have left that is wholly mine, and I will thank you to keep out of it." He watched the words land. He watched the colour go from her face and something steadier and sadder take its place, and he hated himself with a completeness that was almost restful, for it was the one feeling he had never had to learn. "I see," she said quietly. "You do not see," he said, cruel now, deliberate, honing the blade because a clean cut heals fastest. "You have spun a kind man out of a cold one, because it flatters you be the one who found him. It is a pretty story and you may keep it, but keep it at a distance. I have buried everything I ever permitted myself to love. I do not mean to dig a fresh grave for the pleasure of your company. Do you understand me? Whatever you imagine passed between us in that garden, it did not. It cannot. I will not allow it, for your sake far more than mine, and one day, when you are safely married to some honest man who has never given a hostage to fortune, you will thank me for it." "For my sake," she repeated. There was the faintest edge to it now, the first he had ever heard from her. "For yours. Then let me be the judge of my own sake, sir, as you are so free to be the judge of yours." She lifted her chin, and for all her humble station she looked, in the dim smoke-stained light, more nearly a duchess than any perfumed lady his sister had ever paraded before him. "You would send me off to a safe and honest man and call it kindness. But you have not asked whether I want to be safe. You have only decided that you cannot bear to want anything, and dressed your fear in my name and called it a gift. It is not a gift, your grace. It is the meanest thing you have yet done, and you have just told me you have done a great many mean things." The truth of it struck him like a blow, and because it was true he did the last cruel thing, the unforgivable thing, the thing he could never afterward unsay. He laughed, one short, cold, ruined sound in the cold gallery. "How fine," he said, "to be lectured on the meanness of my heart by a companion who came to Penhall with one gown and no dowry, and who has plainly reckoned that the shortest road out of servitude runs through a widower's grief. I had thought better of you, Miss Ledford. I find you are like all the rest, only cleverer in your approach. Sybil Ellingham at least does me the courtesy of wanting the title outright." He knew it was a lie as he said it. He knew it was the vilest lie he had ever told, that she had never once by word or look sought a thing from him, that she was the single soul at Penhall who had wanted nothing but the truth of him and had been given this poison in return. He said it because it would work. He said it because a woman with her pride could not stay in a house where such a thing had been said to her face, and if she would not save herself, he would drive her to safety with whatever weapon lay nearest. Even this one, even the one that damned him past all forgiving. Fian went very still. He watched the words do their work, watched them cut, deep and clean, exactly where he had aimed them. When she spoke again, her voice did not shake, and that steadiness was the most terrible reproach of all. "You do not believe that," she said, "which means you have said it only to be rid of me. I could forgive you your grief, your grace. I could have forgiven you a lifetime of it. I do not think I can forgive you the lie, for the lie was a choice, and you made it with your eyes open." She curtsied, a small, perfect, dreadful courtesy. "You may keep your grief. God knows you have made a home of it. I only hope, when the house of it burns down at last, there is someone left who will dig you out. It will not be me, you have seen to that." She left him there. He heard her steps go the length of the gallery unhurried, and he did not turn to watch her go, for if he had turned he would have called her back, and he could not call her back, because he had at last succeeded in the only thing he had set out to do. The portrait looked down at him, Cordelia and the painted hand and the dead spaniel. He stood before it a long time in the failing north light, ungloved, his ruined hand hanging open at his side, and felt the dull clover again, felt the ice grind back into its old and settled place, and knew, with the cold clarity of a man who has just won a battle he never wished to fight, that he had made himself perfectly, permanently, safely alone. It was what he had wanted. He had told himself so for 7 years. He waited to feel the relief of it, and waited, and it did not come. The silence he had chosen closed over him like water over a dropped stone, and for a full day Leofric let it. He kept to the east wing, to the study where the curtains stayed drawn against the summer light, and he told himself that this was mercy. He had sent her from him with the cruelest words he owned, that he was a house with the shutters nailed, that whatever he loved he buried, that she would do well to gather her plain grey dresses, and go back to whatever corner of the world had been foolish enough to spare her. He had watched her face while he said it. That was the part he could not lay down. He had made himself watch, the way a man forces his eyes open at the surgeon's knife, and he had seen the colour leave her cheeks and something steadier than grief settle in her eyes, and still he had not stopped. Now he sat with a cold cup at his elbow and a letter he had not read, and he found that the silence did not feel like mercy at all. It felt like the 7 years before her. He had grown so accustomed to that quiet that he had forgotten it had ever been a wound. It had become simply the shape of his days, the temperature of his blood. But she had come blundering into it, spilling ink, mistaking the names of his ancestors on the portraits, laughing at her own clumsiness in a house where no one had laughed in longer than the youngest footman had been alive, and she had shown him, without once meaning to, that the quiet was not peace. It was only the held breath of a man too frightened to feel the next thing. He rose and went to the window and put his hand to the curtain and did not open it. Below him, faintly, he heard the sounds of a house rearranging itself around a departure, a trunk set down too hard on the flagstones of the hall, a maid's quick step. Mrs. Anwell, the housekeeper, giving some low instruction, and beneath it, he strained to hear it and hated himself for straining. No voice that was hers. Fian was not arguing. She was not lingering in doorways hoping to be called back. She was doing the thing he had commanded her to do, with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything, and it was unbearable. He let the curtain fall, and the small darkness of the room came back around him, and he understood that he had chosen this darkness 1,000 mornings running, and called each choice grief. The truth arrived in him not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, terrible clearing, the way a fog lifts off the park at mid-morning and leaves every branch and blade suddenly, mercilessly distinct. He had told her he buried what he loved. He had said it as though it were a fact about the world, a law like gravity, a thing done to him. But it was not done to him. He had buried Rosalind 7 years ago, yes, his wife and the child that had never drawn breath beside her, and the earth had taken them, and he had had no say in it. Grief he could not have prevented, but everything after, the nailed shutters, the drawn curtains, the servants who flinched, the 7 years in which he had permitted no music and no visitors and no candle burned a moment past its purpose, that he had done. himself. With his own hands he had built the tomb and then complained that he lived in a tomb. He had made his grief into a fortress and called the fortress fate. And when a living woman had climbed the walls of it, not by force, never by force, but simply by being warm in a cold place, he had done the only thing his fear knew how to do. He had thrown her out before she could be taken from him. He had grieved her in advance so that no grave could surprise him. He had chosen the certain wound over the possible joy, and he had dressed the cowardice up in the fine coat of self-sacrifice and told her it was for her own good. For her own good, he said aloud, and the words were ash in his mouth. He thought of the afternoon in the library when she had found him with Ruslan's miniature in his hand, and she had not gasped or fled or offered him the smooth cold comfort that everyone else offered, the comfort that was really a request to please stop making them uncomfortable with his sorrow. She had sat down on the floor beside his chair, heedless of her skirts, heedless of every rule that said a woman of her station did not sit at a duke's feet, and she had said, "She must have been very easy to love for you to have loved her so long." And he had not been able to speak, and she had let him not speak, and she had stayed until the light went out of the windows without once asking him to be other than he was. No one had done that. In 7 years, no one had simply stayed. They had all come to be seen doing the correct thing beside his sorrow, and then gone home to their warm suppers relieved to be out of it. Sybil Ellingham had come oftenest of all, elegant, accomplished Sybil, who knew precisely which mourning was fashionable and precisely how long a duke might decently be indulged in it before a sensible new duchess was procured. She had never once sat on a floor. She had never got ink to her wrist or laughed at herself or looked at his silence as anything but a flaw to be corrected in a man otherwise so eligible. He had understood dimly that the county expected him to marry her, that it would be tidy, that she would keep his curtains exactly as drawn as propriety required and no more. And he saw now, in the clearing light, that a marriage to Sybil would have been only the tomb with a second occupant who found it comfortable. He would not have it. He would not spend the half of his life being managed. He would rather stand in the wreckage of his own pride than sit one more evening across a polished table from a woman who had never made his heart do anything at all. He was moving before he had decided to move. Out of the study, into the corridor where the light struck him like a blow after the dark, past the row of ancestors whose names she had cheerfully mangled, and the sound that came up the great stair to meet him stopped his heart cold. Wheels. The crunch of carriage wheels on gravel at the front of the house. "Where is she?" he said to the first servant he came upon, a scullery girl frozen against the wall with a coal scuttle, and the child was too terrified of him to answer, and he heard the terror, and was ashamed of it, of all the years he had let himself be a thing that terrified children. "Forgive me," he said more gently, and her mouth fell open, for the Duke of Penhall did not beg pardon of scullery maids and had not, perhaps, ever. "Miss Ledford, is she in it?" The trunk's gone down, your grace," the girl managed. "She's to leave on the hour." He did not wait for more. He took the great stair 2 treads at a time like a boy, his coat flying his dignity, that famous, freezing dignity that had kept the whole county at arm's length for 7 years, abandoned somewhere on the landing above. Servants pressed themselves flat against the walls to let him pass, and he saw their astonishment as a smear of pale faces, and he did not care. Let them talk. Let all of England talk. He had spent 7 years being careful, and it had earned him nothing but a beautifully kept mausoleum and the sound of the only warmth he had ever been given rolling away down his own drive. At the turn of the lower landing a figure rose to meet him, Sybil herself, come no doubt to preside over the graceful removal of the inconvenient Miss Ledford, arranged upon the settle in a mourning gown the colour of dove feathers, a picture of serene proprietorship. "Your Grace," she said, rising with a small knowing smile, extending a hand as though to steady him, to slow him, to fold him back into the shape the county had cut for him. "You are flushed. Let the girl go quietly. It is far the kindest way. Come, sit, and we shall—" "Forgive me, Miss Ellingham," he said, and did not stop, and did not take the hand, and did not sit. He went past her so swiftly that the ribbons of her cap stirred in the wind of it, and he heard behind him the small, sharp intake of a woman who had, for the first time in her calculating life, been left standing with her hand out and no one in it. He felt no triumph. He felt only that a door long stuck had finally given, and cold clean air was pouring through. The great doors stood open to the July morning. The carriage waited at the foot of the steps, the horses shifting, a footman just closing the boot upon her single modest trunk. And there, at the carriage door, in the plain grey travelling dress he had mocked, with her bonnet already tied and her gloved hand already lifted toward the step, stood Fian. "Stop," he said. It did not come out as he meant it. He had meant it to be a summons, the voice that moved a household without effort, but it cracked in the middle like green wood, and it came out closer to a plea than a command, and perhaps that was why she stopped. She turned. Under the shadow of the bonnet her face was composed, but he had learned her face by now, had studied it in firelight and daylight and had it by heart, and he saw what the composure cost. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She had wept privately where no one could use it against her, and then she had dried her face and tied her bonnet and prepared to walk out of his life without making him watch her break. Even now she was protecting him. It undid him utterly. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady. That steadiness was a wall she had built in a single night, and he had taught her she needed it, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. "You need not have come down. I understood you perfectly the first time." You understood nothing. He came down the last of the steps until he stood on the gravel before her, and the footman melted away, and the coachman found some fascinating fault with his reins. "You understood a lie I told you very well, 'cause I told it very well. I have had 7 years' practice at that particular lie, but it was a lie, Fion, and I will not let you drive off into the world believing it, whatever else you believe of me after." Something flickered behind her eyes. She kept it down. "You said you bury what you love. You said it in your own hall, plainly, and I do not think a man who chooses his words as carefully as you says such a thing by accident." "No, I chose it. God help me, I chose it to wound you, because a wounded thing runs, and I wanted you to run before." He stopped. His hands had come up between them, open, useless, and he made himself go on, because he had nailed every shutter in that house with his silence, and he would not add one more. "Before I could learn what it is to lose you, I could survive burying you at 70, I thought. I could never survive it now, so I decided to lose you today on purpose while it was still in my power. I called it your protection. It was mine. It was the last coward's bargain of a coward's 7 years, and I am ashamed to my soul that I made it with your heart as the coin." The carriage horse stamped. Somewhere a wood pigeon called, absurdly ordinary. She was staring at him as though he had begun speaking a language she had despaired of ever hearing from him. "Rosalind died," he said, and it was the first time in 7 years he had spoken her name aloud to another living person, and it did not shatter him as he had always feared it would. It only ached cleanly the way a set bone aches. She died, and the child with her, on a night in March, and it was no one's doing and no one's fault, and there was nothing to fight and no one to blame, and I found I could not bear a grief with no enemy in it. So I made an enemy of the world. I closed the house. I closed myself. I told everyone it was mourning, and mourning is respectable. Mourning has a shape society understands. But it was not mourning any longer, Fion, not for years. It was hiding. I was not honoring her. I was using her memory as a wall to keep out anything that might make me feel enough to be hurt again. He drew a breath that shook. "And then you spilled an entire inkwell across my grandfather's map of the estate, and you looked up at me with your hand black to the wrist, and instead of trembling like the rest of them you laughed, and something in me that I had believed dead and decently buried sat straight up in its grave." A sound escaped her, half a laugh, half a sob, caught in her throat and pressed back down. "You are the first thing in 7 years," he said. "That made me want to open a curtain." "You cannot say these things to me," she whispered, and now the wall was going. He could see it going, brick by brick, in her wet eyes. "And then let me get into this carriage. It is not kind. If you mean to send me away silent. Do not give me this to carry." "I am not sending you away." He took one step nearer, and then, with the whole household surely watching from every window of Penhall, he did the thing he had not done for any soul living or dead in 7 years. He took off his glove. And he reached out and closed his bare hand very lightly around her small gloved one where it rested on the carriage door, and he felt the tremor go through her, and he did not let go. "I am asking you not to go." Not for the house. Not because a duke has bidden it. I am asking as the man you sat beside on a library floor when he could not speak. I have no gift for this. I have forgotten how, if I ever knew. But I would rather stand here and make a fool of myself before every servant I have than spend one more hour behind those curtains pretending I did not feel the room grow warm the day you walked into it. Her fingers turned within his, gripped, and held. You told me, she said unsteadily, that I should go back to my plain grey dresses and my corner of the world. I was a liar and a coward, and I am neither from this hour. If you will only. His voice failed him again. He, who had faced down magistrates and creditors and grief itself without a flicker, found he could not finish the sentence for the terror of what her answer might be. So he did the only thing left. He bent his head. The Duke of Penhall feared the length of 3 counties, bowed his proud head before an overlooked girl in a travelling dress on his own gravel drive, and he pressed his brow, for a single unguarded moment, to the back of her captured hand, the way a supplicant bows before something holy. Stay, he said against her glove, so low that only she could have heard it over the shifting of the horses. Stay, and I will spend whatever years are given me learning to be a house with the windows open. I cannot promise I will do it well. I can only promise I will do it. And that I will do it beside you, honestly, and never again hide behind the dead to keep from loving the living. He lifted his head and looked at her, and there was nothing left of the wall in his face, nothing of the freezing dignity. Only a man laid entirely bare in the morning light with his heart in his open hand. I have buried a great deal, Fine Ledford. I am done burying. I am asking you to help me learn the other thing, the harder thing, the staying and the feeling and the daring to be glad. Will you get down from that carriage? Will you stay? The words were out of him now, all of them, and there was no gathering them back. Leofric stood in the low grey light of the servants' passage where he had found her, his hat crushed forgotten in one hand, and he did not move to shield the scar that ran white from his temple to the corner of his jaw. For 7 years he had turned that side of his face from every living soul. He turned it toward her now. He had told her everything, the overturned carriage on the Penhall road, the fire that came after, Eleanor's hand slipping from his own in the smoke, the child that had never drawn breath. He had told her the thing he had never said aloud to any man, that he had lived, and had not forgiven himself for living, and had built a silence around that unforgiveness and called it grief, because grief was the nobler word. And if Fine Ledford stood before him with her plain travelling cloak half fastened and a valise at her feet, for she had been leaving. She had been leaving because he had sent her away, and she had been near enough to gone that another quarter hour would have taken her past the gates and into the mail coach and out of his life forever. He understood, looking at her, that he had come within a breath of losing the second irreplaceable thing his own cowardice had ever set at risk. You should say something, he managed. His voice was not the voice Penhall knew, the flat cold instrument that ended conversations. It shook. I have laid the whole of it at your feet. I have no more to give you and nothing left to hide behind. I would rather you struck me than stood there so quiet. She did not strike him. She reached up, slowly, the way one reaches toward a horse that has been beaten and does not yet know a gentle hand from a cruel one, and she laid her fingers along the ruined side of his face, along the scar itself which no one had touched in 7 years, which he himself could not touch without flinching. He did not flinch. He shut his eyes and let the warmth of her palm rest against the place he had hated longest. You great foolish man, she said, and there were tears standing in her voice though her hand was steady. Did you truly believe this would send me running? I have washed worse than a scar. I have sat up nights for the dying and closed their eyes at the end and thought them beautiful. You showed me the very worst of yourself and called it a warning. Do you know what I saw? Her thumb moved once, gently, across the seam of the old wound. I saw that you loved her. I saw that you are a man who does not stop loving because a thing is buried. And I thought, God help me, Leofric. I thought, there is a man who would never let go of me either. He opened his eyes. The passage was narrow and dim and smelled of tallow and cold stone, no fit place for anything, and it seemed to him the most consecrated ground he had ever stood upon. Then stay, he said, not as the arrangement would have it. Not because your uncle's debts made a bargain of you and my name settled them. I release you from every clause of that agreement. Do you hear me? The whole cold contract of it, torn to nothing. You owe this house nothing. You owe me nothing. He drew a breath that hurt. Stay, because I am asking you, a plain man to a plain woman, hat in hand, with no rank between us and no rescue in it for either of us. Stay, because I cannot learn to live again without you in the room. That is the whole of my reason, and it is not a noble one, and it is the truest thing I have ever spoken. For a moment she only looked at him, and he saw her weighing it, not the offer, he understood later, but the honesty of it, testing whether he meant the man and not the arrangement, whether she was being wanted or merely being kept. He had scorned her once, in the first days, for her rough hands and her country vowels, and the way she had upset an entire tray of Sèvres before the assembled county. He had watched Sybil Ellingham and her circle make sport of her at the long table and had said nothing, and his silence had been its own cruelty. He had a great deal to answer for, and he knew she was remembering it too. You did not always ask so kindly, she said quietly. No, he would not soften it. I let them laugh at you and I did not lift a finger. I named you Clumsy in my own heart when the truth was that you were the only warm-blooded thing that had walked into Penhall in 7 years, and I could not bear how it thawed me. I punished you for that. I am ashamed of it. If you stay, I will spend every day I am given unteaching myself the man who did that to you. He knelt, he the Duke of Penhall, who had not bent his head to living creature since the funeral, knelt on the cold flags of a servant's passage and took her chapped, capable hand in both of his. Fienne, marry me in earnest. Not the arrangement, me. She made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, and she went down onto her knees too, there in the dust, so that they were level with each other, so that no man could have said one knelt above the other. Get up, you daft creature, she whispered, but she did not let go of his hands. You'll ruin your good breeches on a floor I mopped this morning. And then, when he did not move, yes, yes, of course it is yes. It has been yes since the night you thought no one saw you weeping in the West Gallery and did not send me away for seeing it. I only needed you to want to be seen. She pressed his knuckles to her lips. I want the man, Leofric. I have never once wanted the rest of it. Take the coronet and the great cold house and the 40 rooms nobody sits in. I'd have followed you to a curate's cottage with a leaking thatch. It was always only you. He drew her up and into him and held her as though the 7 years had been a single held breath, and he might at last let it go. He did not kiss her yet. He pressed his brow to hers and stayed there, breathing her in, the wax and the lavender and the honest smell of a woman who worked, and something in his chest that had been clenched like a fist since the fire came slowly, aching open. They were married 3 weeks later, and he would not have it done quietly. That was the thing that astonished the county. All had assumed the mourning Duke, if he stirred himself to wed at all, would do it behind closed doors and drawn blinds, a furtive signing away of the awkward little bride to spare everyone the sight of her. Instead, the invitations went out under the Penhall seal to every family for 30 miles, and the great house that had stood shuttered for 7 years threw back every shutter at once. Leofric walked its cold corridors ahead of the day, and ordered the Holland covers stripped from the furniture, the chandeliers let down and washed until they wept light, the long gallery, Eleanor's gallery where her portraits still hung, open to the sun. He stood a long while before that portrait the morning of the wedding. He had feared it would feel a betrayal. It did not. The painted eyes seemed to him not reproachful but relieved, as if some long vigil were being lifted from them at last. I loved you, he told the portrait, low, so that only the empty room could hear. I will not stop, but I am done dying alongside you. She has taught me the difference, and I think you would have liked her enormously. She is nothing at all like you, and that is precisely why I can bear it. He had the gallery hung with white roses after that, and he had not turned the scarred side of his face from anyone who came. Fienne came up the aisle of the Penhall Chapel in a gown he had commanded from London against her protests. She had wanted her Sunday muslin, and had only surrendered when he confessed he wished, this once, to give her something instead of taking, and she came without a soul to give her away, for she had no living father, and her uncle had been the architect of the whole grim bargain, and was not welcome. So Leofric did a thing that set the whole chapel murmuring. He came down from the altar to the chapel door and offered her his own arm and walked her up the aisle himself. every eye upon them, the Duke and his overlooked bride, and dared the county with his level grey stare to make one sound that was not glad. None did. But he saw Sybil Ellingham near the front, in the pure family's consequence entitled her to her mouth a thin pale line. He had once, in the cold years, thought Miss Ellingham handsome and correct and safe, a woman who would never disturb a silence, who would furnish Penhall with a suitable duchess, and demand nothing of his frozen heart. He looked at her now, walking fine past her, and felt only a distant astonishment that he had ever mistaken a cold thing for a safe one. It was at the wedding breakfast that the last of it was set right. The long table was laid where once the county had watched Fine send the Sèvres crashing, and Leofric rose at the head of it with his glass in hand, and the room went still in the old way, braced for the Duke's cold few words and swift withdrawal. "You have known me 7 years as a silent man," he said. "Most of you have known me only as a warning to your children. Do not stare at the Duke, do not speak of the Duke. The Duke does not smile." A ripple went round the table, uneasy, uncertain whether they were permitted to acknowledge it. He let them be uncertain. "You were right not to smile, in those years. There was nothing in this house worth smiling at, and I had made it so." He turned and looked down the length of the table to where his wife sat. "Some of you were unkind to the woman who is now your Duchess, when she first came among you and knew none of your ways and upset a tray of china in her nervousness. I remember every one of you who laughed. The silence sharpened, more than one face went still. He did not name them. He did not need to. Each knew their own guilt, and Sybil Ellingham knew best of all. I remember, 'cause I stood among you and laughed in my heart, and I have been paying for it in shame ever since. So let me say plainly, so that no one at this table or in this county need ever wonder again where I stand." He raised the glass toward Fionn, and his voice did not shake now. It rang. "She is the finest creature I have ever known. She walked into a dead house and would not let it stay dead. She saw a scoured and savage man that the whole shire had given up as lost, and she did not flinch, and she did not flatter, and she did not scheme. She simply refused to let me go on being lost. Every warmth this house will ever know again it will owe to her. I ask you to drink to your Duchess. And I ask you to understand that the man who values her least in any room I enter will have chosen me for his enemy." They drank. They drank, he noted, with a good deal more feeling than duty required, and he understood that a household and a county had been waiting 7 years for permission to be glad, and he had just given it. Down the table someone laughed, a real laugh, warm, and then the whole room seemed to exhale and warm at once, and Fionn was pink to her ears and pretending to be cross with him for making a spectacle, and he found that he was smiling, broadly, helplessly. For the first time in 7 years the Duke of Penhall was smiling in front of the assembled county, and it did not feel like a betrayal of his dead. It felt like a debt to his living, at last being paid. The seasons turned kindly on Penhall after that. He learned her, slowly, as a man learns a country he means to spend his life in. He learned that she could not abide a shut door, and went through the great house flinging them open, that she talked to the gardeners by name and knew their children's ailments, that she could not sing a note in tune and sang anyway loudly in the mornings, so that the maids caught and hummed it, so that the whole cold house filled up with her tuneless joyful noise, until he could not remember how the silence had ever sounded. He learned that she cried at nothing and laughed at less and touched his scar without thinking now, absently, the way one touches a familiar thing one loves. He learned to let his own doors stand open. He learned to weep in front of her, once on the anniversary, and to be held, and to find that the grief when shared did not diminish him, but only strangely made room. There came a spring 2 years on, when he stood at the tall window of the west gallery, no longer the room of his weeping, but the room where they sat of an evening and watched her below on the south lawn. She was great with child now, moving slow and careful across the grass where once nothing green had been permitted to grow, because green things reminded him of what died. She had made him plant it. She had put a spade in his own hands and made him turn the earth himself, and now there were crocuses out, and she was walking among them with one hand at the small of her back and the other shading her eyes, looking up to find him at the window, as she always somehow knew to do. He raised his hand to her. She raised hers. The child, when it came that summer, was a daughter, red-faced and furious and perfectly whole, and when the midwife laid the small weight in his arms, Leofric found that his hands, which had not held anything living and new since the night that took Eleanor and the son who never breathed, did not shake at all. He carried her to the window so that the light fell on her. He turned deliberately so that the first thing the tiny unfocused eyes met of her father was the scarred side of his face, the whole of him nothing hidden. There, he murmured to her. You will grow up thinking a man's face is a thing that carries his history plainly, and you will be right, and you will not learn to look away, because your mother never did. He bent and set his lips to the downy head. She taught me that. She will teach you everything worth knowing. I only mean to stand near enough to catch what falls. From the great bed Phaon watched him, worn and radiant and laughing at him even now. You'll talk the poor mite to sleep before she's an hour old. And he crossed to her and sat on the edge of the bed with their daughter between them, and put his free arm about his wife and gathered the whole of his life into the circle of one embrace. He had been a man frozen at the center of a great cold house, a warning told to children, a widower who had confused his grief for penance and his silence for love. And a clumsy, tuneless, warm-handed woman of no rank and less polish had walked in past every locked door he owned and refused to leave, and had thawed him back into a living man against all his own bitter effort to remain a stone. Do you know, he said against her hair, I once believed the best thing I could do for you was to send you away. I know, she said. You were always a poor judge of what was good for you. It is why you needed me. He laughed. The sound came easy now, worn smooth with use, and he held his wife and his daughter in the warm gout of a house that had learned how to be a home, and the Duke of Penhall, who had not smiled in 7 years, could not for the life of him now remember how to stop.